Write in the comments which country you're watching from and which sultan fascinates you the most. If you're interested in the hidden stories of the Ottoman Empire, subscribe to the channel. Imagine a man called Yıldırım, the Thunderbolt, a sultan so swift, so devastating, that his armies seemed to teleport across continents. He crushed crusader knights, brought kings to their knees, and stood at the gates of Constantinople. He was invincible, until he wasn't. This is the story of Bayezid I, the conqueror who met his match, lost an empire in a single day, and suffered a fate so humiliating that it became a dark legend for centuries. The Sultan in a cage. In the heart of the 14th century, a new power was being forged in the crucible of Anatolia and the Balkans. The Ottoman Sultanate, under the iron-willed Murad I, was not yet an empire of legend, but a relentless military machine fueled by faith and conquest. Into this world of unceasing war, a prince was born, Bayezid. He was not raised in silken pavilions, but in the saddle. His lullabies were the clang of steel and the call to prayer. His education was a brutal duality. One hand held the Quran, the other the hilt of a scimitar. From his father, he inherited a profound sense of destiny, a belief that the world was a prize to be seized by the boldest. But where Murad was methodical, a patient strategist, Bayezid was a storm. A fire burned within him, a ferocious impatience that saw diplomacy as a delay and negotiation as a weakness. As a young governor in Kütahya, he tasted power, and it was an intoxicating nectar. He learned the complex dance of tribal loyalties, the art of taxation, and the swift, merciless application of justice. He watched his father balance the ambitions of his Ghazi warriors, the piety of the ulama, and the intricate politics of the Byzantine remnants and Serbian principalities. Bayezid absorbed these lessons, but filtered them through his own aggressive nature. He saw a world of enemies to be crushed and territories to be annexed. He did not see a chessboard of delicate moves. He saw a battlefield waiting for a thunderous charge. His elder brother, Yakub, was the more temperate, the more respected commander, perhaps even the favored son. This was a silent, gnawing reality for Bayezid. It was a rivalry that sharpened his ambition into a blade, teaching him that power was never given, only taken, and that the greatest threat often slept in the tent next to your own. This prince was not merely a successor. He was a predator in waiting, and the throne was his intended prey. June 28, 1389, the Field of Blackbirds, Kosovo. Here, history holds its breath. Two worlds collide as Sultan Murad I leads his Ottoman forces against a formidable coalition of Balkan princes. The battle is a maelstrom of chaos and courage, a desperate struggle that will define the fate of the region for centuries. Amidst the carnage, the unthinkable happens. The Sultan, Murad, is struck down, assassinated in the very heart of his camp. The news spreads like wildfire, a whisper of panic that threatens to shatter the Ottoman lines. The victory, so close, could yet turn into a catastrophic rout. In this moment of supreme crisis, one man's will solidifies. Bayezid, his heart a cold stone of resolve, sees not just peril, but an opportunity born of blood. His brother, Yakub Çelebi, a valiant and popular commander, is elsewhere on the field, leading his troops to a decisive victory. He is unaware that his father is dead. The path to the throne is now open, but it is a path for one man only. Bayezid acts with a speed that would come to define him. A message is sent. Your presence is required by the Sultan. Yakub, ever the loyal son and soldier, rushes to his father's tent. He enters, expecting to give a report of his success, perhaps to receive the praise of a proud father. Instead, he is met by silence, by shadows, by the grim faces of his brother's loyal executioners. There is no trial, no argument. In the dim light of the command tent, with the sounds of a battle still raging outside, the life of Prince Yakub is extinguished. He is strangled with a silk bowstring, the customary method for royal executions, ensuring no sacred Ottoman blood is spilled upon the ground. Bayezid, now the sole heir, steps out into the night as the undisputed sultan. His throne was secured not in a palace, but on a battlefield. It was not anointed with holy oil, but baptized in the blood of his own brother. The law of fratricide, a brutal tool to prevent civil war, had been invoked, and the reign of Bayezid I had begun. The blood of Kosovo had barely dried when the new sultan unleashed his fury. Bayezid I was not a man to mourn or to consolidate power slowly from a distant capital. His reign began, as it would continue, at a relentless, terrifying pace. The Balkan lords who had survived the battle soon learned the nature of their new adversary. He swept through Serbia, securing its vassalage, and, in a stroke of political mastery, taking the Princess Olivera Despina as his wife, binding the Serbian dynasty to his own. But his true challenge lay to the east, in Anatolia. The Turkish Beyliks, the Karamanids, the Germianids, and others saw the death of Murad as a chance to reclaim their independence. They had misjudged their man. Bayezid wheeled his army around with astonishing speed, leaving his European frontiers to march back into the heartland of Anatolia. His campaigns were not sieges, they were blitzkriegs. He would appear before a city's walls when he was thought to be hundreds of miles away, his movements so rapid they seemed supernatural. He crushed the Beyliks one by one, annexing vast territories and unifying Turkish Anatolia under his banner in less than a decade. It was during these whirlwind campaigns that he earned his immortal epithet, Yıldırım, the Thunderbolt. He would be fighting in the east, and before news of his victory could even reach the west, he would reappear in the Balkans to put down a rebellion or confront an encroaching Hungarian army. In 1396, this legend was cemented in the eyes of all of Christendom. A massive crusader army, led by the flower of European nobility, marched to Nicopolis on the Danube to drive the Turks from Europe. They were arrogant, certain of victory. They found not a cautious defender, but a thunderbolt. Bayezid, force-marching his army from the siege of Constantinople, fell upon them with devastating force, annihilating one of the last great crusades. Yıldırım was no longer just a man. He was a force of nature, the master of 2 continents, and the most feared ruler of his age. Victory brings more than just territory. It brings treasure, tribute, and the intoxicating poison of absolute power. As Bayezid's domains swelled, so did the opulence of his court. The rugged Spartan camp of his father, Murad, gave way to magnificent palaces in Bursa and the new capital of Edirne. The Sultan, once a warrior who shared the hardships of his men, was now an emperor, surrounded by a complex hierarchy of viziers, eunuchs, and sycophants. A serpent began to coil around the heart of the Thunderbolt's power. This serpent had many heads. One was hubris. The man who had defeated the greatest army Europe could muster began to believe himself invincible, chosen by God to rule the world. He dismissed warnings from his advisors and grew increasingly isolated, listening only to those who echoed his own sense of grandeur. Another head was the changing nature of his court. His Serbian wife, Olivera Despina, brought with her a retinue of Christians and their customs. While a brilliant political alliance, it introduced a cosmopolitan, and some whispered, decadent, influence. Wine, forbidden by Islamic law, was said to flow at the Sultan's private feasts, a source of scandal for the pious Ghazi warriors who had formed the bedrock of his father's power. They saw the old ways, the simple faith and martial focus, being eroded by imperial luxury. The administration itself became a source of internal strife. Bayezid centralized power to an unprecedented degree, stripping authority from the old Turkish noble families and giving it to officials from the devshirme system, slaves raised in his household, loyal only to him. This created a deep well of resentment among the Turkish aristocracy, men whose ancestors had ridden with his own. They saw their birthright being given to servants. While Bayezid was focused on his grand ambitions, the final conquest of Constantinople, these internal fractures were weakening the foundations of his state. The Thunderbolt was at the zenith of his power, But he was blind to the serpent of pride, resentment, and decadence growing within his own palace walls. And far to the east, another storm was gathering, a conqueror who would exploit these very weaknesses to devastating effect. While Bayezid's armies thundered across the Balkans, a different kind of war was being waged in the halls of power in Edirne. This was a war of ink, law, and administration, masterminded by a figure as crucial to the Ottoman ascent as any general, the Grand Vizier, Sandalı Ali Pasha. He was the architect of an empire, not just a dynasty of conquerors. Ali Pasha saw the inherent fragility of their new reality. The Ottomans were a military machine superimposed upon a vast, diverse, and resentful collection of peoples. To simply rule by the sword was to build a house on sand. His grand gamble was to transform this military enterprise into a centralized, bureaucratic state, a true empire in the Roman tradition. He began by reforming the state's finances, creating the first Ottoman treasury, the Deftahane, to systematically track tax revenues from conquered lands. This was revolutionary. It shifted power from plunder and feudal warlords to a central government that could fund a standing professional army, the Janissaries, loyal only to the Sultan. He streamlined the Divan, the imperial council, turning it into an efficient instrument of governance. He established the Qadi system, a network of Islamic judges, imposing a unified legal framework across Anatolia and Rumelia. This wasn't merely about administration, it was a profound psychological shift. It told the conquered peoples, Christian and Muslim alike, that Ottoman rule was not arbitrary chaos, but a new, permanent order. Many of the old Turkish aristocracy, the Ghazi warriors who lived for the raid, saw this as a betrayal of their traditions. They chafed under the yoke of scribes and tax collectors. But Ali Pasha and Bayezid understood a deeper truth. To hold an empire, the pen must eventually become as mighty as the sword. It was a gamble that would either forge a lasting state or tear the fragile coalition apart from within. The news of Ottoman advances sent a tremor of existential fear through the courts of Europe. The fall of Bulgaria, the vassalage of Serbia, this was no longer a distant frontier skirmish. This was a storm breaking upon the gates of Christendom. In response, Pope Boniface IX issued a call for a new crusade, and the eagles of European chivalry answered. This was to be no ragtag peasant army. This was the pride of a continent. From France came the finest knights of the realm, led by the rash and arrogant John the Fearless, Count of Nevers. From the Holy Roman Empire, knights in gleaming plate armor. From the Knights Hospitaller, the seasoned warrior monks. They converged in Hungary under the command of its ambitious king, Sigismund, forming a magnificent host, perhaps 60,000 strong. Their confidence was absolute, bordering on suicidal. They saw the campaign not as a war, but as a grand chivalric adventure, a glorious ride to Constantinople and beyond, to Jerusalem itself. They dismissed the Turks as undisciplined rabble, their sultan a desert chieftain who would surely flee before the might of armoured lances. As they marched down the Danube, their campaign degenerated into a parade of arrogance. They massacred the populations of captured Bulgarian towns, refusing the counsel of their more experienced Hungarian allies. They boasted that if the sky were to fall, they would hold it up on the points of their lances. They were blind to the reality of their enemy. They did not see a barbarian horde. They were marching towards a disciplined modern army led by a tactical genius. Bayezid, the Thunderbolt, was waiting. He was not cowering. He was luring these proud European eagles, step by glorious step, into a cage of their own making near the fortress city of Nicopolis. On the 25th of September, 1396, the fate of the Balkans would be decided on the plains outside Nicopolis. The Crusader army, a sea of steel and noble banners, was impatient for glory. Ignoring King Sigismund's plea for a coordinated battle plan, the French knights, led by John the Fearless, demanded the honour of the first charge. It was a fatal act of hubris. With cries of Montjoie Saint-Denis, they spurred their heavy war horses forward, a thunderous avalanche of chivalry aimed directly at the heart of the Ottoman line. What they found was not the disorganized rabble they expected. Bayezid had prepared a killing ground. The French charge slammed into a line of sharpened stakes, hidden behind a screen of lightly armed skirmishers. Horses were impaled, knights thrown to the ground, and the momentum of their glorious charge shattered into bloody chaos. As they struggled to regroup, Ottoman archers on the flanks unleashed a storm of arrows that blotted out the sun. Still, the French knights fought with desperate courage, breaking through the first lines of infantry, only to find themselves exhausted and facing Bayezid's elite, the Anatolian Sipahis. It was a meat grinder. Meanwhile, Sigismund advanced with the main body of the army, only to be smashed by a devastating flank attack from the Serbian contingent under Stefan Lazarević, who, as Bayezid's vassal, fought for the Ottomans. The Crusader lines disintegrated. The battle turned into a rout, a massacre. Thousands were cut down as they fled towards the Danube. The Great Crusade, the pride of Europe, was annihilated in a mere 3 hours. Bayezid walked the battlefield that evening, his face grim at the sight of his own heavy losses, and ordered the execution of thousands of prisoners in reprisal. The dream of a united Christendom pushing back the Turks died that day. Nicopolis was not just a defeat, it was the tombstone of the crusading ideal. The victory at Nicopolis was absolute. The message it sent was undeniable. The Ottomans were the masters of the Balkans. Europe was terrified, its military pride broken, its capacity to challenge him seemingly exhausted. For Bayezid, this was his apotheosis. He was no longer just a Ghazi warlord or a Balkan conqueror. He was an emperor in all but name, the undisputed power of the region. He adopted the title Sultan of Rum, a claim of sovereignty over the old Roman lands of Anatolia, a direct challenge to both the fading memory of Byzantium and the legacy of the Seljuks. His power was now oceanic. With his European frontier secured, he turned his relentless energy east to finish what he had started in Anatolia. One by one, the remaining Turkish beyliks, Karaman, Jermian, Saruhan, were crushed and absorbed. His dominion now stretched seamlessly from the Danube in the west to the Euphrates in the east. He controlled the vital trade routes that connected the Black Sea to the Aegean, making him the master of 2 seas and the lands between them. His court in Bursa became a center of opulence and power, attracting scholars, poets, and architects. He tightened his grip on Constantinople, launching a blockade in 1394 that would last for 8 years, slowly strangling the ancient capital, whose emperor was now little more than a glorified mayor in his own city. Bayezid stood at the zenith of his power, a colossus astride 2 continents. He had humbled the eagles of Europe and unified the Turks of Anatolia. In his own mind, and in the eyes of the world, he was invincible, his destiny manifest. But as he stared west at the walls of Constantinople, a far greater storm was gathering behind him, in the heart of Asia. A conqueror of even greater ambition and cruelty was riding west, and Bayezid, in his pride, was utterly oblivious. While Bayezid, the Thunderbolt, stood astride the Balkans, his gaze fixed firmly on the gilded domes of Constantinople and the heartlands of Christian Europe, a different story was being carried on the desert winds. It arrived not with the clang of armies, but in the haunted eyes of refugees and the hushed tones of merchants traversing the Silk Road. From the scorched plains of Persia, from the ruins of Isfahan and the sacked cities of Georgia, a new name was being whispered, a name that tasted of ash and fear: Timur. In the opulent courts of Bursa, these were just stories, tales of a distant barbarian, a lame warlord from the steppes. Bayezid, conqueror of crusaders, the sultan who moved faster than thought, saw no equal on the world stage. Why should he fear a nomadic chieftain, however ambitious? Yet, the stories persisted, growing more detailed, more terrifying. They spoke of pyramids built from the skulls of the vanquished, of entire populations put to the sword, of cities so utterly erased that farmers would later plough the earth without knowing a metropolis once stood there. This was not conquest as Bayezid understood it. This was annihilation. This was a force of nature. The refugees who trickled into eastern Anatolia were not merely defeated soldiers. They were the remnants of entire civilizations. They told of Timur's uncanny genius, his mastery of siegecraft, his army of many nations, bound by terror and the promise of unimaginable plunder. A shadow was creeping westward, a vast and patient predator. It consumed kingdoms, digested empires, and its appetite was insatiable. Bayezid, in his pride, heard the echoes but failed to comprehend the sound. He was the storm, the Yıldırım. He did not yet realize that a hurricane was gathering on the far horizon, a maelstrom of destruction given human form, and it was slowly, inexorably, turning its gaze toward Anatolia. To understand the cataclysm that was to befall Bayezid, one must understand the man known to the West as Tamerlane. He was born Timur, meaning iron, in his native Chagatai tongue, and he was lame, crippled in his right leg and right arm from youthful injuries, a fact his enemies used to mock him, and a fact he turned into a symbol of his indomitable will. He was not a direct descendant of the great Genghis Khan, a crucial detail in the Mongol world, but he married into the bloodline and brilliantly crafted a persona that made him the Khan's spiritual and military successor. He was a paradox, a devout Muslim who patronized the arts and sciences, who could debate theology with the most learned scholars, and yet whose cruelty was legendary, almost biblical in scale. He saw himself not as a mere conqueror, but as an instrument of divine wrath, the scourge of God sent to punish the decadent and the corrupt. And in his eyes, the entire world was corrupt. His military career was a 3-decade saga of relentless, systematic conquest. He subdued Persia, shattered the Golden Horde, invaded Russia, and descended upon India, leaving the Sultanate of Delhi a smouldering ruin. His methods were a terrifying form of psychological warfare. Before a siege, he would offer terms. If the city surrendered, it would be spared. If it resisted, its fate was sealed. The pyramids of 90,000 skulls outside Isfahan and the 70,000 outside Baghdad were not acts of random savagery. They were messages, monuments of terror broadcast to any who would dare defy him. His army was a reflection of his empire, a multi-ethnic, disciplined fighting force of Turks, Mongols, Persians, and Tajiks, fanatically loyal to the man who led them to victory after victory and enriched them beyond their wildest dreams. This was the man whose path was now converging with Bayezid's, not just a king, but a global phenomenon. A grandmaster of strategy, a connoisseur of cruelty, and a man who believed destiny had personally chosen him to rule the world. Before the clash of swords came the clash of egos, a war fought with ink and parchment that sealed the fate of an empire. The diplomatic exchange between Timur and Bayezid stands as one of history's most venomous and revealing. It began with Timur, the patient predator, sending an ultimatum. His letters were a masterclass in veiled threats and calculated condescension. He addressed Bayezid as a mere frontier emir, a son, reminding him of his own vast conquests and his role as the protector of the true faith. He demanded that Bayezid submit, surrender the renegade princes who had taken refuge in the Ottoman court, and acknowledge him as his overlord. To refuse, Timur wrote, would be to awaken the sleeping dragon of strife. Bayezid, the Thunderbolt, a man whose pride had been forged in the fires of Nicopolis and a lifetime of unchecked victory, was incandescent with rage. His response was not diplomatic. It was pure insult. He dismissed Timur as a crippled brigand, a lowly Tatar, unfit to address a sultan descended from a noble line. He mocked Timur's physical infirmities and boasted of his own martial prowess. In one infamous passage, Bayezid threatened that if Timur did not face him on the battlefield, he would be forsworn, and his wives would be divorced from him according to Muslim law, a grave and unforgivable insult. He concluded with a challenge. I will pursue you to the plains of Tabriz and Sultania. The letters flew back and forth, each more inflammatory than the last. Timur's replies grew colder, more menacing, detailing the fates of those who had defied him. Bayezids became more arrogant, more reckless. The Ottoman Sultan was being played perfectly. Timur, the grandmaster strategist, was not just preparing a military campaign, he was conducting a psychological one. He was goading the famously impetuous Bayezid, stoking his anger, clouding his judgment, and drawing him into a conflict on grounds, and at a time, of Timur's own choosing. While Bayezid assembled his grand army, confident in his power, Timur was already waging a different kind of war, a war of whispers, promises, and resurrected loyalties. The Ottoman Empire, for all its might, was a young entity. Its rapid expansion under Bayezid had been brutal and swift. He had not just defeated the Turkish beyliks of Anatolia, he had swallowed them whole, deposing their ruling families and absorbing their lands. He had unified Anatolia under the Ottoman banner, but the unity was skin deep. Beneath the surface, resentment simmered. The dispossessed emirs, many of whom had fled to Timur's court, harbored a deep and bitter hatred for the man who had stolen their birthright. Timur, a genius at exploiting his enemy's weaknesses, saw this fault line and struck it with precision. As his vast army moved into Anatolia, he did not present himself as a foreign invader. Instead, he styled himself as a liberator, a restorer of the old order. He sent agents to the commanders and soldiers within Bayezid's army, who hailed from the annexed principalities of Karaman, Aydin, and Menteşe. He promised to return their lands, to restore their emirs, to free them from the Ottoman yoke. His first major act on Anatolian soil was the siege of Sivas. The city, defended by Bayezid's son Ertuğrul, fell after a brutal siege. In a chilling display of his methods, Timur promised the Armenian Christian defenders he would not shed their blood, a promise he kept by burying them alive en masse. The message was clear: resistance means annihilation, but cooperation offers reward. Bayezid, blinded by his own arrogance, was marching toward a battle where the enemy was not only in front of him, but also within his own ranks. The very foundations of his Anatolian empire, built on conquest and fear, were being systematically eroded before a single major battle had been fought. The Thunderbolt was charging into a trap, unaware that a significant portion of his own storm was about to turn against him. The prize was so close. From his siege lines, Bayezid could almost taste the fall of Constantinople. The ancient capital of the Caesars, the jewel of the Bosphorus, was starving, exhausted, and on the verge of surrender. For 7 long years, his armies had constricted around it, and now, final victory seemed inevitable. This would be his crowning glory, the achievement that would echo through eternity. But from the east, a shadow was stretching across Anatolia, a shadow cast by a man whose name was whispered with a unique blend of awe and terror. Timur, known to the west as Tamerlane. The letters exchanged between the two titans were not correspondence. They were declarations of war, dripping with insults and challenges. Bayezid, the Thunderbolt, flush with victories from the Danube to the Euphrates, saw Timur as another Asiatic warlord to be crushed. His pride, forged in the fires of Nicopolis, had become a blinding arrogance. He could not perceive the sheer scale of the storm gathering on his eastern frontier. In a decision that would seal his fate, Bayezid abandoned the siege of Constantinople. He gathered his vast army, a formidable force of janissaries, sipahis, and vassals from across his empire, and turned east. He would not wait for Timur to come to him. He would march to meet this challenger and destroy him. The campaign began in the blistering heat of the Anatolian summer of 1402. It was a punishing, forced march. Bayezid, believing Timur was still besieging Sivas, pushed his men relentlessly, chasing a phantom. Dust choked the men, water was scarce, and the sun was a merciless hammer. The army that had been poised to conquer the Queen of Cities was being bled of its strength, not by the sword, but by the unforgiving landscape and the Sultan's own impatient fury. He was not merely marching towards a battle, he was marching into a meticulously prepared trap, his every move anticipated by a mind as patient and ruthless as the desert itself. When Bayezid's exhausted army finally reached the plains near Ankara, they found nothing. The enemy was not there. The Sultan, a brilliant tactician in his own right, had chosen his ground well. He established a fortified camp near a stream, a vital source of water that would refresh his weary troops and give them a defensive advantage. He allowed his men a few days of rest, confident that he had outmaneuvered his rival. He believed Timur was still blundering through the Anatolian plateau. But Timur was no blunderer. He was a grandmaster of strategy, and he had made a move of breathtaking genius. While Bayezid was on his grueling march east, Timur's massive army had executed a wide, sweeping arc to the west, screened by the terrain. He had bypassed Bayezid completely. As the Ottoman army rested, Timur's forces descended upon the very camp Bayezid had just vacated, and crucially, seized control of the region's primary water source, the Chubuk stream. The trap was sprung. Bayezid awoke to the horrifying realization that his enemy was now behind him, cutting him off from his own supply lines, and worse, sitting comfortably beside the only significant river on the plain. The hunter had become the hunted. The psychological impact was devastating. Bayezid's army, already depleted by their forced march, now found themselves in a parched, dusty wasteland, staring across the heat-shimmered fields at Timur's forces, who were watering their horses and filling their flasks from the cool, flowing stream. Every tactical advantage was now with Timur. He had chosen the battlefield. He had the water. He had a rested army. For the Ottomans, the field of battle was no longer a place of potential victory, but a crucible of thirst and despair. The fight for an empire would begin with a desperate fight for a single drop of water. On the 20th of July, 1402, under a sky of brass, the battle began. There was no choice. Driven mad by thirst, the Ottoman army had to attack. Bayezid placed his finest troops at the center, his loyal Serbian vassals under Stefan Lazarevic on the right flank, his Anatolian levies on the left, and himself, surrounded by his sons and the unbreakable Janissaries, in the heart of the formation. The initial Ottoman charge was ferocious. The Serbian heavy knights, clad in black armor, smashed into Timur's lines with legendary courage, fighting like lions and pushing the enemy back. For a moment, it seemed the Thunderbolt's fury might overcome even these impossible odds. But Timur's plan was not simply to win through brute force. It was to dismantle his enemy from within. As the battle raged, the treachery began. The Anatolian beyliks, princes whom Bayezid had recently conquered and forced into his army, saw their moment of revenge. On the left flank, their banners turned. They wheeled their cavalry around and charged not into Timur's forces, but into the rear of their own Ottoman comrades. The left wing disintegrated into chaos. The betrayal was contagious. The Tatar cavalry, who had served Bayezid for years, saw their kin fighting in Timur's ranks and felt the pull of blood over loyalty. They too abandoned the Sultan, leaving his right flank dangerously exposed. The Ottoman army collapsed inwards. Soon, only the center remained, a small island of loyalty in a vast, raging sea of enemies. The Serbian knights fought a heroic rearguard, buying precious time for Bayezid's eldest sons, Suleiman and Mehmed, to escape the carnage. But for the Sultan, there was no escape. He was surrounded, his grand army shattered, his empire crumbling in the dust around him. The day belonged to Timur. The circle of Janissaries around Bayezid shrank with every passing minute. These were the elite slave soldiers of the empire, men whose only purpose was to serve and die for their sultan. They fulfilled their oath to the last man, their white turbans becoming crimson blossoms in the Anatolian dust. As his final guards fell, Bayezid, the warrior king, made a desperate bid for freedom. With a handful of retainers, he spurred his horse, attempting to break through the encircling enemy. For a man who had moved like lightning his entire life, it was a race against fate itself. But his horse, exhausted from battle, finally stumbled and fell. The Sultan was unseated, crashing to the ground. In an instant, he was swarmed by Timurid soldiers. The mace was struck from his hand, his helmet torn from his head. The man they called Yıldırım, the Thunderbolt, the conqueror who had made emperors tremble, was a captive. His hands were bound. The world stood still. He was brought before the throne of Timur. The contrast was absolute. Timur, the lame conqueror from Samarkand, sat calmly, the master of the field, while Bayezid, the proud Ottoman sovereign, stood before him as a prisoner, his royal garments torn and stained with dirt and blood. This was more than the capture of a king. It was the shattering of an imperial destiny. The man who had believed himself to be God's chosen instrument for conquest now faced the architect of his humiliation. The psychological shock was profound, an abyss opening beneath his feet. All the victories, all the conquests, all the power and the glory had been extinguished in the glare of a single afternoon sun. The Thunderbolt had not just been defeated, he had been utterly and completely broken. The Battle of Ankara was over. The dust settled on a field of Ottoman dead, and the architect of their ruin, Timur the Lame, Tamerlane, now possessed the ultimate prize, the Sultan himself. Bayezid the Thunderbolt, the terror of Christendom and the master of Anatolia, was a captive. But Tamerlane was not a man for simple executions. He was a connoisseur of power, and he understood that a dead enemy is forgotten, while a humiliated one serves as the eternal lesson. Thus began the final, most agonizing chapter of Bayezid's life, a story that has echoed through history as the legend of the Golden Cage. Historical sources dispute the literal truth of it. Some chroniclers, both Arab and Byzantine, speak of an iron cage, a mobile prison in which the once mighty Sultan was displayed like a rare and dangerous beast as Tamerlane's army marched. He was, they say, forced onto a cart and paraded through the very cities he had once conquered, a living monument to Tamerlane's supremacy. Other accounts suggest the cage was a metaphor for a gilded, yet heavily guarded tent or palanquin, a prison of luxury that was no less a prison. Whether literal iron or symbolic gold, the effect was the same. Tamerlane's cruelty was psychological, a meticulous deconstruction of a great man's soul. At his banquets, Tamerlane would have Bayezid brought forth, sometimes kept under the table to be fed scraps like a dog. He allegedly forced Bayezid's beloved Serbian wife, Princess Olivera, to serve wine to the victorious conqueror and his court, scantily clad, a torment designed to break the Sultan's spirit more than any physical chains could. The Thunderbolt, a force of nature that had moved with lightning speed across continents, was now stationary, an object of ridicule. Every sunrise brought a fresh wave of degradation, a public spectacle designed to strip away not just his crown and his freedom, but his very identity as a warrior and a king. This was not merely imprisonment, it was the systematic erasure of a legacy, orchestrated by a rival who knew that the deepest wounds are not inflicted upon the body, but upon the pride. While Bayezid endured his private hell, the empire he had forged with blood and iron began to disintegrate. A state built on the absolute authority of a single victorious ruler cannot function without him. The news of Ankara was not just a military defeat, it was an existential shockwave that fractured the very foundations of Ottoman power. The Sultan, the pillar holding up the sky, had been taken, and in his absence, chaos descended. The first to act were Bayezid's sons. They had escaped the battlefield, but they brought the conflict with them. In Edirne, the European capital, Sultan Çelebi declared himself Sultan. In Bursa, the Anatolian heartland, Isa Çelebi did the same. And in the eastern province of Amasya, the shrewdest and most patient of them, Mehmed Çelebi, began consolidating his own power base. A fourth son, Musa, initially a captive with his father, would later enter the fray, adding another layer to the bloody struggle. This was the beginning of the Ottoman interregnum, the Fetre Devri, a decade-long civil war that tore the empire apart. The brothers were not merely fighting for a throne, they were fighting over the carcass of their father's legacy. Vassals who had bowed to the Thunderbolt now sensed weakness. The Serbian Despotate and Wallachia reasserted their independence. In Anatolia, the Turkmen beyliks that Bayezid had brutally annexed rose up, reclaiming their ancestral lands with Tamerlane's blessing. The intricate tapestry of Ottoman control, woven over decades, was unraveling thread by thread. The empire was effectively split in three, with each son ruling a fragment, waging relentless war against his own blood. Alliances were made with Byzantine emperors, Genoese merchants, and local warlords, anyone who could offer a temporary advantage. The Ottoman dream of a unified realm spanning two continents seemed to be dying, drowned in a sea of fratricidal ambition. The singular will of Bayezid had been replaced by the warring ambitions of his children, and the price was paid by the people who suffered through a decade of uncertainty, plague, and perpetual warfare. The Thunderbolt's capture hadn't just imprisoned a man, it had uncaged the demons of civil war. For 8 agonizing months, Bayezid withered in Tamerlane's custody. The conqueror continued his westward march, dragging his prized captive along as a perpetual symbol of his triumph. For Bayezid, each day was a new torment. He was a warrior king, a man of boundless energy and pride, now reduced to a powerless spectator of his own humiliation and the dismemberment of his life's work. The reports that trickled into the camp would have been devastating. His sons were at war with one another, his empire was shattering, and the edifice he had built was crumbling into dust. His health, both physical and mental, began to fail catastrophically. The man who had once seemed invincible was now visibly frail, consumed by a profound despair. The sources surrounding his death are as murky as his final days. The official Timurid version claims he was treated with respect and died of a sudden illness, likely a stroke or apoplexy, a plausible end for a man under such immense psychological strain. But Ottoman historians whisper of a darker end. They tell a story of a sultan who could no longer bear the weight of his shame. According to this tradition, Bayezid, seeing no hope of release and unable to endure the sight of his wife's degradation, took his own life. Some say he used poison, concealed in a ring. Others tell a more gruesome tale, that he repeatedly smashed his head against the iron bars of his cage, choosing a brutal death over a life of dishonor. We will never know the certain truth, but whether his heart gave out from grief or his own hand ended his suffering, the result was the same. In March of 1403, in the city of Akshehir, far from his capital and his family, Sultan Bayezid I died. He was 43 years old. Tamerlane, perhaps showing a flicker of respect for his fallen adversary, allowed his body to be returned to Bursa for burial. The Thunderbolt was extinguished, not in the flash of battle, but in the suffocating darkness of a conqueror's camp. His death marked the final tragic end to a reign of spectacular ascent and an equally spectacular fall. Bayezid's death did not end the chaos. It only intensified the war between his sons. For another decade, the Ottoman interregnum would rage, threatening to permanently erase the Sultanate from history. In this light, Bayezid's legacy appears to be one of catastrophic failure. He is the Sultan who, through his own hubris, met a foe he could not defeat and plunged his realm into near-terminal crisis. He became a cautionary tale for all future Ottoman rulers, a ghost haunting the imperial court, a reminder of how swiftly glory can turn to dust. And yet, history is rarely so simple. The very crisis he precipitated became a crucible that forged a new, more resilient Ottoman state. The son who eventually emerged victorious from the civil war, Mehmed I, was not a reckless conqueror like his father. He was a patient diplomat, a shrewd administrator, and a meticulous rebuilder. He earned the title Second Founder of the Ottoman Empire precisely because he had to painstakingly piece it back together from the wreckage his father had left behind. The interregnum forced the Ottomans to refine their methods of governance, to strengthen their institutions, and to create a state that was less dependent on the singular charisma of one man. The ordeal purged the system of its weaknesses. In a profound paradox, Bayezid's defeat ensured the empire's long-term survival. Had he not been stopped at Ankara, his rapid, often brutal expansion might have overextended the young state, causing it to collapse under its own weight later on. The shattering defeat and the subsequent recovery created a stronger, more adaptable political entity. It was this reforged empire that just 50 years after Bayezid's death would be strong enough for his great-grandson, Mehmed II, to conquer Constantinople. The Thunderbolt's legacy, therefore, is dual-edged. He is the titan who fell, the symbol of pride preceding a fall. But he is also the unintentional catalyst, the devastating storm that cleared the ground for a mightier forest to grow. His reign is a testament to the fact that sometimes the road to empire is paved not only with victories, but with the lessons learned from the most profound and humiliating of defeats.